morning.
Hey, good morning.
Good morning, David.
Morning, Queen. How are you doing, guys?
Good.
Nice. You have a nice background. The wall.
Yeah, the real thing is why I don't use Teams background when I'm here in my mini corner here. Because I have to put something here. All the MP boards are hanging there, but getting too much. The one from last year is still lying around. This year's is arriving next few days. It's just arriving to replace the older stuff, so I'm gonna tear it down again.
you go.
You can start.
Yes, Nilesh, your screen is on now.
Okay. Hi, friends. Good afternoon. It's been a pleasure having Scott Hanselman with us. I think most of you know who Scott is. Just in case you're not aware of the legend Scott Hanselman, then he is the partner program manager at Microsoft. But apart from that, he is one of the most known faces in the dev area. He is doing podcast at Hansel Minutes. He writes at hanselman.com. That's his blog. He's one of the keynote speakers at most of the Microsoft global events, and he's also the host of Azure Friday. So without any further delay, I would like to introduce or invite Scott, and over to you, Scott.
Cool. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it. This is very nice to spend lunch with my friends in Singapore. I can see myself in the past here on YouTube, and our friends will hopefully show up as well, either in Teams or in YouTube in the next few minutes. I would love it if people would ask questions in the chat, or if it's a really, really good question, as Nilesh mentioned in the beginning, you can raise your hand and ask a question. It always makes for a better talk if you ask a good question. Otherwise, it's just like watching a YouTube. Because this is live, you can interrupt me and say, "Stop, Scott. Stop and show me this other thing," and that would be great. So, what I want to talk about is WSL and why I think it's so wonderful and so significant with what we're doing here. I'm taking a look, Riwut, at how we're capturing things. Do you want to capture the main screen right now, or do you want to capture just my video?
I'm capturing your main screen now.
I'm seeing that. Is that what's going on?
Yes, that's your main screen.
Okay, cool. Is it able to be seen? It seems like it's maybe cut off just a little bit in the top there. Can they see the...
Okay.
I want to make sure that they can see the paths. We're doing a little stream here. And I'll just put it at the top. And you can see my tab at the top. There we go. Perfect. Thank you, sir. Looks fantastic. Cool. All right, my friends. So I'm on Windows 10, as you know. And if you look here, I'm running the Windows terminal. And in fact, I'm running a preview of the Windows terminal. I actually have two Windows terminals installed. You see that I've got Windows terminal here and Windows terminal preview. Right now, this is Windows terminal 1.1, and this one here is Windows terminal 1.2. So you can have them side by side and install these on your Windows machine and get a preview of what's coming, but also have a reliable terminal as well. Now, why do you need a new terminal? This is a really interesting question. Before we start talking about WSL and Linux, we have to go back in time and talk about how terminals and consoles worked on Windows before. So if I just come to the Start menu here and I just type in like command prompt, we'll see kind of the original DOS prompt. We know that it's not really DOS, but it looks like it because you've got the C: prompt here. I can also then type PowerShell and bring that up as well, and that might look a little bit like this. We also sometimes see people using Cygwin. We might have some of our friends using Cygwin. Each of these are painting differently. They are different shells. They are different consoles. They are different terminals. And this is a really interesting problem because I'm already using a lot of words, and all of us in the technology industry are using those words wrong. There is a big difference between a shell, a terminal, and a console. And I actually wrote a blog post about it because it's so easily confused. When we say terminal terminals were originally things like this, a dumb terminal or a typewriter. That does not have a shell or a prompt. It doesn't run bash. It simply prints things out. It's a typewriter terminal. Then consoles came along like this. A console's responsibility is to paint text on the screen, but it's not a shell. It's not the DOS prompt. It's not bash. It's a console. The shell is the application that the terminal is communicating with. So for example, if I go here on PowerShell and I type dir, PowerShell output a string. But who was the responsible person for doing the painting? Who painted this font? What program did that? Did PowerShell paint the words? Windows PowerShell? Did DOS or Windows paint the text here, Microsoft Windows? Well, in fact, that was painted by a thing that's called conhost, the console host. You may have seen these dialogues before. This is a very, very old dialogue. It's called conhost, C-O-N host, and it's very old and it's very bad. This is very bad software that has been around for almost 30 years, and it is got a lot of problems. It's very slow, and it's very frustrating. But what's interesting about it is I want to point out the responsibilities. The shell printed this prompt, and the shell took my text input, but the console painted this window. And the command prompt and PowerShell share the same original old console. That's really interesting. Notice here that this prompt is trying to paint a certain character and it's coming out as a question mark. So it's missing the font support that we need. And in fact, if I do something like this and do a dir/s and I simulate a huge amount of information coming out of a console, this is happening incredibly slowly. Look what happens if I resize. It slows down. The frame rate is slow. In fact, this console is architected in such an old way that the software stops when you start selecting it. It is actually running only as fast as it can get output onto the screen. So what I'm describing here are all reasons why this console is old and why it has to go. But I'm also pointing out that Windows has its choice of different shells, and that's confusing. Now 𝐷𝐸𝐺𝐻, and again, feel free for my friends to say hello in the chat, either on YouTube or on Teams here, and we can answer questions. And 𝐷𝐸𝐺𝐻 has a different console host. 𝐷𝐸𝐺𝐻, look at this, it's an entirely different tool. This is called MinTTY, and it's written to support features that the Windows console doesn't support. So this is another Windows application that's job it is to output text, to go and run applications. Let's see if I can, I think actually it's 𝐷𝐸𝐺𝐻. Where does 𝐷𝐸𝐺𝐻 put its file? 𝐷𝐸𝐺𝐻, I never remember where it is. Tell me if you know in the chat. I think it's off a mount point somewhere over here. SIG drive, there it is. SIG drive, C, look at that. So 𝐷𝐸𝐺𝐻 is outputting this text. This is not using the same console. But again, we have a separation of responsibilities between those two different things. Now I'll try a little trick here. I'm going to share my Surface Pen, and I'm going to draw on my surface here and try to point out again the differentiation between this. Okay, we have our console, and then we have our choice of shells. This is really important. Lots of different shells we have. We have PowerShell, and we have DOS, and we have 𝐷𝐸𝐺𝐻, and we have possibly, in a little bit, I'll talk about Wsl. And they all express their prompts in different ways. They output strings, and those strings get output to this console. Now, as we move into the future, why do we keep using such an old and terrible console host as this one? Maybe we do something better. So what Microsoft has done is they have created the Windows terminal, and it's completely rewritten from scratch, and it supports multiple shells. It's written in DirectX, it's written in C++, it's got cool features like it's transparent, supports backgrounds, has advanced font features, it's incredibly fast. It's basically as fast as a game. So you're looking at hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of frames a second. This is important. It is gorgeous. Thank you, Mary, for saying that. It's a really great tool, but people get confused and they think by releasing a terminal, this is a new shell, okay? And I think now we understand that it's not a new shell. What it is it is the Windows terminal, and it is a new way for these shells to paint their strings more effectively. Does that make sense? Great. I love that folks are saying that they're already using that now. So that's cool. Now, the benefit of this is that it's completely configurable. Swesh is saying, will the shell open with elevated permission? That's a great question. I'll go ahead and open one with elevated permission right here. You'll see that I've opened a shell with elevated permission, and I've actually changed my prompt to include a lightning bolt to let me know when I am administrator. So that's a nice little technique to let me know when I've got an elevated shell. So that's a great question. Thank you for that. Now, I have added to mine PowerShell and Linux and all these other different things as options. I've done that by going to the settings dialog, and the settings is in fact just a JSON file. And in that JSON file, in the future, there'll be a UI for this. In that JSON file, I can do things like pick my font face, and I've picked one with what are called power line glyphs. PL means power line. You'll notice here in my prompt, I've got a few interesting things like that's interesting, that's interesting. This little thing here is interesting. Those are called glyphs. And they are not usually in your standard fonts, but they're really just lovely looking things. And if I go to another, see, another Git repository, this one has 3 items added, 7 items modified, and no items removed. This one is a clean branch. I've also added my blood sugar because I'm a diabetic. So I actually have an implant that sends my blood sugar to the cloud, and I'm outputting my blood sugar in my prompt. You could put the weather there. You could put anything that makes you happy in your prompt. And that is only possible because of this glyph and that font support inside of this lovely terminal, which again, I want to point out I can make transparent so you can see behind it, right? Now, this menu that is configurable here is totally set by me, and I can go and put these wherever I want to. So given that I can have any shell that I want, now it gets you thinking about why you would want to have Linux on Windows. And the reasoning behind that is this. A lot of times you're a software developer, IT person, and you go out and you Google for something, and maybe you search for how to install Redis, right? Or how to install Ruby. And you go to a nice website, and the website says, cool, thanks, welcome. Start here. It says open a terminal, and then it says this symbol. And Windows developers know that that symbol right there means that they're not welcome. It's not your place, is it? That symbol indicates a bash shell or a Linux shell. And as soon as a Windows developer sees that, they're kind of locked out of things because their prompt maybe looks like this, or their prompt looks like this. So having Linux on Windows would be a really great opportunity for people to run the software that they want to run on the operating system that they want to run. I like using Windows, but I've also used Linux and Unixes for 25 years. I want the benefits of all of those things. So that would mean a new shell. Okay, so let's do this. Let's go out to my command prompt, and I'll clear this out. And I'm going to type wsl-list-v. And it's going to list out the Windows subsystem for Linux distributions on my machine. And you'll notice that some of them are version 2, and one of them here is version 1. That's really interesting. Okay. Let's think about that. And again, you've all been very quiet. Only a few of you have asked questions. I want to remind you, this is not a YouTube video. I'm a real person, and I'm really here. So I would encourage you to ask questions that you couldn't get answered watching a YouTube, and I'll be sure to fit them in as we go, because I'm a real person. I'm going to type wsl-d for distro. I see Puneet is typing, and I thank him for that. And I'm going to type wsl-d Alpine. Okay. Yeah, I love that. Swesh is saying, yeah, you see that $sign and you close the tab and you say, well, I guess this isn't a place for me. So look, I just ran Alpine, which is a Linux distribution, a little tiny one, and I did it instantly. I want to show how quickly that started. I'm going to run it again. 1000. It actually happened in less than 1 second. Now this one is running WSL version 1. So what does that mean? Let me run something. I'll run top. Now Chin is saying, I read that there's a Linux kernel running now. This is a great question, and we're going to talk about that, because what I just did is I ran top on top of Alpine here. I want to go into the task manager, and I want to show you something. Alpine uses a thing called BusyBox, and I want to point out that that's a process. But the Windows Task Manager here is a list of Windows processes. So why are 2 Linux processes showing up in this list? Okay, this is a little bit confusing, so I want to make sure that everyone gets this, so pay attention. In WSL1, there is no Linux kernel. Okay, and when WSL makes a call, what's called a syscall, like open a file, there's no Linux kernel, so Windows does the work. With WSL2, there's a real Linux kernel, and it's inside what's called a utility VM. And when WSL2 makes a syscall, Linux does the work. Okay. Oops, I can't type. And we have some great questions in the comments here. We see Chin is saying, I read that there's a Linux kernel running now. Yes, there is a real Linux kernel that is installed and running, and you can see the code on GitHub. It's a fork of the Linux kernel. It's the LTS, or the long-term support Linux kernel, and that is real. That means that WSL2 is incredibly compatible. It is very, very fast and very compatible because it is really Linux. Now, Puneet is asking, is there a way to interact with services installed in Linux through Windows? I love that question. Let's actually answer that question. Let's try this. Let's answer Puneet's question right now. So here I am inside of Windows. Okay, I'm in PowerShell. Now I'm going to go and I'm going to say bash. Now I'm in Ubuntu. Hit exit. I'm back. You see how you move in and out? Let's go and start up another separate tab, an Ubuntu tab. And I'll make a folder here. We have an empty directory, home directory. And let's go and say, we'll make a directory to answer Puneet's question. We'll go into that directory, and I'm going to say .NET new web. We're going to make a .NET application in Linux. I want to point out this is really Linux. Ubuntu right there. And Puneet's application is here. I'm going to say .NET Run in Linux. And that's going to pop up. And then I'm going to open up a browser in Windows. We're not in Linux, we're in Windows. I'm going to say localhost. And really quickly, I need to change a cached setting inside of, I always have this problem. I'm setting a cache setting called a worker. What are these things called? Service workers. There we go. I always have this trouble. This is a little bit interesting. Whenever a demo doesn't work, it's nice to know I can skip it, but I want to tell you what's going on. So there's a thing that's called HSTS that says that you should stay secure once you've hit a secure site once. And on Edge, you need to actually clear that setting. This is the new Edge using Chromium. And if I recall correctly, HSTS is a cached location. Clear HSTS Edge cache. And the Edge, there we go. Right there, it's an internal cache, HSTS. And I'm going to go and clear that. Delete domain security policies for localhost. Delete that. Go back here. There we go. Okay, so sorry about that little bit of confusion there. That was a cached security policy. So to answer Puneet's question, we are now opening up localhost 5001 on Linux. WSL is automatically tunneling from this port to this port. It's a simulation. It's not really localhost, but you have the same machine, so it feels like it is. We can actually prove this by opening up TCP view. And if you look here, ports 5000 and 5001 are right there. Who has them open? WSL host. So yes, that is how you interact with APIs through Windows. Great question. Now, Riwut and Chin are asking questions about Hyper-V and the Linux kernel. It's a little bit more complicated. So Swesh is saying, well, no, it's not running on Hyper-V. And Chu is saying, well, it is behind the scenes. It's funny, you're actually both right and you're both wrong. And it's not your fault because it's a weird thing. Let me show you what's going on and let's answer that question because it's very confusing. This is where you go to say, turn Windows features on and off. You remember this area here? This is where you turn on the Windows subsystem for Linux, which is right there. Okay, now the question was, is it running on Hyper-V? Yes, kind of. So Hyper-V is up here, and that's the name for the Windows Complete Virtual Machine System that you would install on a Windows professional machine. And if you have done this before, you'll actually run Hyper-V Manager. This only runs on Pro. But look, I don't have any virtual machines running here. Hyper-V Manager, the Hyper-V branded service, only works on Windows 10 Pro. So it's not technically Hyper-V. But here's where it gets messy, and this is where you're both right. We've actually turned on the virtual machine platform and Windows hypervisor platform. It is using a Windows hypervisor. It is not using Hyper-V exactly the client scenario. The reason that these are separated and why they are different than this, to answer that question that Chin and Swesh are discussing right now, is because Hyper-V is only available on Pro. This is super important. Lots of people have Windows 10 Home. Who needs to be able to run Linux, my friends? students, right? Regular people. We don't want to make it so you have to buy the professional version. Windows 10 Pro supports Hyper-V, but Windows 10 Home supports this virtual machine platform. And what that means is that you don't get Hyper-V, but you do get WSL. Now, Chu is saying it's running Hyper-V behind the scenes. Yes, it's using what's called a utility virtual machine. And you can see it right here. Remember before with WSL1, we saw the process in the task manager, but now we don't. We see instead VMM. That is our utility. Yes, Chin is right. It's a Linux kernel running on a hypervisor. I just want to be clear. I'm not correcting you as I'm being very, very language specific. This is interesting because if we go back over here and we say WSL-list-v, we actually have 1, 2, 3, 4 different Linuxes all running at the same time, and they start up fast. Let's start up Kali Linux. You see how it's not actually running? If it was Hyper-V, firing up a Hyper-V virtual machine takes 30 seconds, quite a bit minutes. But with this, I can say WSL-D 1000. Takes less than a second. So this is not the same. Great question from Cheng Qiang. Does this mean if you have Windows 10 Pro, you disable it, Hyper-V? You can turn off Hyper-V, the client, yes, and it will still work as long as the virtual machine platform is still there. You will lose access to this, the Hyper-V manager, but it does in fact use a hypervisor. So that's a great, great question. Awesome question here that was brought in from the YouTube stream that Nilesh has pasted in. Jainesh is asking, what happens if the same port is running in Windows? Great question, Jainesh Sharma. In fact, the first process in Windows that sees the port, the first one wins. We can actually simulate that. Let's try that. That's a great question. I'm going to go out to the command line here. We're in Ubuntu. Let's go and run Puneet's application. His application, you'll recall, is running on port localhost 5000. Okay. Now, let's do this. Let's go back over to Windows. Let's go out to the desktop, and we'll make a Puneet on Windows directory, and we'll make a .NET New web application. And when I run this, it's going to try to start up on port 5000, isn't it? Okay, it's going to do its build. There we go. Look at that. Failed to bind to address already in use. So it doesn't matter who gets there first. Whoever gets there first wins. So in that question there, we can now see that that port is in fact owned, in this case, by the WSL host. That's a great one. Now, Chin is asking a very interesting question here, saying, well, these are all different Linux distributions that are all installed, but are they all running on the same Linux kernel, or do they get their own kernel and their own separate VM? So the kernel space is not shared, but the actual kernel itself is shared. So that's a good question. So you're getting user space for Ubuntu, user space for WLinux, user space for Kali Linux, but the same kernel. Now, if you don't like that, you can actually compile your own WSL kernel. Again, all of this is completely up to you. We don't want to make people have to not have choices. So if you want to compile your own Linux kernel, you can do that. It's totally cool. The source code is available, and you can install your own. So if you're a kernel hacker, you can definitely go and do that. All right. So yes, they are different user space distributions. Now, Nilesh, do you have your hand up, sir?
Yeah, there was a question earlier, Scott. Will the shells open with the elevated permission?
Yes, we answered that one. It does open. I'm going to go ahead and just press Control and Shift and open up the shell, and you'll notice here that the shell has got a little, I made a little, this is my prompt, and I said, When it's administrator, make a lightning bolt.
Okay.
So yes, you can definitely run it as an administrator. Good question. Thank you for double checking on that one. Okay. Can we map ports from Windows to WSL? Ooh, that's an interesting one. So that would be, if you start doing complicated port mapping, then you're talking about Docker. And that's a really interesting question. Let me actually switch back to my drawing screen here, and we can talk a little bit about that. Because if you start making your networking too complicated, you might as well just use Docker. And that's where things are pretty cool. So I'm going to take this screen here, and I'm going to clear it out. And we'll start from scratch, and we'll see if we can talk about that question. So in the old days, Docker on Windows is what we're talking about. Docker on Win 10, okay? It would use Hyper-V, and it would create a thing that was called the Moby VM. And the Moby VM ran on Hyper-V. It was an automated virtual machine, and no matter what you were doing, Docker would go and it would call into the Moby VM, which was running a tiny little version of Linux. And it was quite slow because you've got Docker calling Moby, but remember this is running in Hyper-V, which is running on Windows, and Windows is down here. And you didn't really get a really nice native experience. Now with WSL, if we can go and have this tiny utility VM, so we've got Win 10 here, and then we can spin up that little VM mem, that little utility VM that starts in just a second. And now I can have as many Linuxes as I want. Docker made their own. They have their own distribution, and that makes things really clean and simple. Check this out. We go back here. When I said WSL-list-v, notice that there's the Ubuntu that I was using, but there's a Docker desktop and a Docker desktop data. And those are hidden. Notice that they don't actually appear in this list. Docker desktop, which I will run and I'll bring over onto this monitor, on Windows is really great now because you click on Resources, WSL, and it says, which distribution do you want to use Docker? And do you want to use that new feature? Okay. By the way, Chu is having an interesting question. If we use Docker on Windows, which uses WSL, which uses the hypervisor, can you use VMware? Yes and no. You have to use the VMware for Hyper-V. There's actually a VMware new version. I believe it was called, here you go. VMware Workstation now supports Hyper-V. So as long as you're using the newest VMware that supports Hyper-V, you don't have to choose. You can run VMware and WSL at the same time. A good question, Chu, because that's been a real problem because VMware has its own hypervisor. So good question. Now, here, I'm going to go and say Docker images, and I'm going to list out my Docker images. Here's a bunch of Docker images. I'm doing this Docker images from Windows. Now, if I go over to Ubuntu and I say Docker images, look at that. This is really important. I get the same list. This is really, really interesting. That means that everyone gets to share the same Docker. That's super cool. Additionally, that means that the tools that I'm going to use, like this, you see, this is the Docker for Windows application. And look, there's the same list of images. Okay. And I can go and run these as much as I want. I can control them, I can delete them, whatever. I can do all my cleanup. I have one machine with multiple operating systems. And what this allows me to do is something like this. If I'm in Windows here, and I'm going to go over to my podcast website. This is a real website that I use. It's my real website. I'm going to run Docker build. I'm now going to go, there it goes. I'm building a .NET application in Linux from the Windows command prompt using Docker. I'm going to actually run my tests headless inside of that, and I know that it just works. And if I run that from inside of Linux, it will also work. Chin is saying that WSL Linux shell can run as either Windows administrator or non-administrator. Yes, there are also hacks that are not supported, like this tool here, that I don't have installed because it has security issues. But if you feel strongly, you can find other ways to do that. But yes, you can start it as administrator or you can start it as non-administrator. It's always the same way it works in Windows. Okay. Now to get back to Puneet's question, if we were to then start our Docker container, I'm going to go and run this command here, Docker build, and then I've got another one called Docker run. There's where your port mapping starts happening. So let's go and say Docker run. Docker is better at port mapping than WSL and Windows are. So once I've decided to map these things around, I'll let Docker do that work and punch through the ports that it needs to punch through. And in doing that, I can set up Kubernetes or anything complicated, and it becomes really quite trivial and very powerful. So in this case here, I'm mapping outside, inside. So I've just brought up a copy of my podcast website running on Docker, powered by WSL2. I started it from Windows, and I just got a native, clean, fast Docker experience, which is really, 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 really nice. Okay. Now here's where it gets really interesting. And I want to make sure people are following this and that they understand. And the questions I'm getting here are excellent, so I hope people are appreciating this and understand it. Now, there might be some folks on the call who do Go. They write Go. You'll notice that I do not have Go on my computer, right? So I don't have any way to run Go or debug Go. But here I have a folder with some source code in it, and in that folder is some Go. How would I deal with that? Do I need to install Go and I need to go and set that up? Well, in fact, what I can do is I can run Visual Studio Code from this folder. Here's Visual Studio Code firing up. Now watch in the lower left-hand corner in a moment. This folder contains a dev container, a development container. I'm going to reopen it. Now watch the lower left-hand corner. Visual Studio Code has now split in half. The client is running on Windows. The server is running inside of a container. Okay? And that container here we go, is running all of the Go stuff for me. So I can now do something like this. And I typed in fmt format dot, and this just popped up in IntelliSense, giving me access to tools that I don't really actually have, right? Because they're running in the container. I can go and build this application. I can even open up, look at this. I can even open up a terminal now, and I'm inside the container looking at my Go code. So I could go and hand Mary, for example, who appreciates this feature, I could say, here's a folder. There's a dev container in that folder. Just open it up. And what's that dev container look like? It's a combination of two things. One, it's a dev container.json with a Docker file in it. and then a list of extensions that it would need in order to run this code. But remember that I said I don't have Go installed. I don't want to install a bunch of extensions. So what I want to do is I want to have a separation between my local installed extensions, of which I have 35, and this dev container, which has its own individual extension that is only used when the container is opened. Okay? So there's some great questions. Chin has some lovely questions here, talking about this kernel starting up in a VM and mounting the local file system. It depends. So in this case here, if I'm in Puneet's folder, right, we look at pwd, we're on the Linux file system in the home folder, and we're in Puneet's folder. Now, I'll just push this directory on the stack, and then I will go up into the mount points. That's where NTFS is. Then I can go down into there. And this is actually using Samba servers, and it's not directly mounting NTFS. You can see now I can go into Scott and desktop. Now, here's the gotcha. There's always a gotcha. It turns out that WSL2 does not talk to the Windows file system very fast. All right. Thank you very much, Mary, for staying up. I appreciate it. Mary's in central US, up very late. So here's the thing that's interesting. The file system access is slow. If I'm on Linux, think about this. I'm on Windows, I'm running Linux, and now I'm talking back to Windows. You're adding a lot of layers. You're adding a lot of unnecessary layers. So I want to keep my code not on the Windows file system. I want to keep it on the Linux file system. To be clear, WSL2 file system access on home, the Linux file system, I'm going to say this in all caps, is 10 times faster than WSL1. That cannot be overstated. Chu has an excellent question. Can we access the distro's file system through Explorer? Okay, buckle up, my friends. I know everyone wears their seatbelts that side, but buckle up anyway. Remember Puneet's code here? It's in home Scott Puneet on the Linux file system. What if I actually said explorer.exe? That is a Windows executable. Linux doesn't have that. So instead it fails, and we catch it and we tell Windows about it. And it launches anyway. So we just launched Explorer, and look what we did here. There's WSL looking at that folder, and there's the files. So if we look at this here, WSL $ is a local share. We're doing what's called a Plan 9 folder, a Plan 9 share rather, Plan 9 server. So this allows me to do this. You ready for this? Notepad program.cs from Linux into Notepad, because it's over the network. Isn't that lovely? Okay. I'm glad that people are learning. This makes me happy. It's a little confusing, but here's what you can do, my friends. You can go and tell all of your friends and all of your coworkers that are not blessed to come to our user group today. You can go and explain this to them, because it's a little confusing. Okay? And let's think about that maybe visually, because it is incredibly intricate. One of the things that's important is to not say, oh, it's just Hyper-V. I think we've proven that it's not just anything. Viputta is asking, what is the Windows 10 version that I am using? I am using Windows from April, this build here. Now, for those of you who can't use that version, 2004, which is April 2020, soon we'll have a version of WSL2 that will work on 1909 and above. 1909 would be September of last year. So take a look and run WinVer and see what version you have. If you have 2004, you have WSL. Otherwise, you can wait a little while and we'll get you one that will be supported in older versions of Windows. When I do that WSL -v, -list, pardon me, -v, oops, there we go. Notice the versions. If I were to convert Alpine from version 1 to version 2, I would need to say WSL set version Alpine 2. And what it will do is it will zip up those files, convert that distribution, and unzip it. Chin is asking what the file system is. Such wonderful questions, my friends. Good job. Let's find out. How do I know my Linux file system? I think it's FS tab or DF. Let's try DF. DF is a file system. You can see a couple of things there. You see the C drives and how they're mounted. There we go. Thank you for your help. DF-T. There it is. ext4, 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 your temps, and then your Plan 9 servers. Lovely. Thank you for your help. Chin Kim Leong is doing a lovely job of backing me up and teaching us all something really interesting at the same time. I think it's also fun to see that these are things I can run. Nothing crashed. I can run HTOP. And you can see I have 20 processors on my machine. And I can see exactly what's going on and exactly how much memory I have, which brings me to another point, which is limiting WSL memory with an interesting feature called Wsl Config. And that was added in a recent version. And Wsl Config is, Wsl Config is documented. I'm going to show you the documentation in a moment. There we go. Wsl Conf. This is really useful. I think that Chin will like this. You can decide where your mounts are going to happen, if they happen or not, what your root mount is going to be, how much memory it uses, whether it allows interop or not, whether you're going to have the Windows path. You can compact WSL2 memory as well. There's a new feature called memory reclamation with compact memory. So for example, here, we look at our memory right now. You can see that all those Linux distributions, my friends, still not using as much RAM as Microsoft Edge. So don't worry too much about your memory issues, kids. But let's try compacting memory there. I always forget how to do this. Probably forgot my password too. Ruwit is asking about GPU programs. Absolutely, that's coming soon. WSL2 GPU support was actually announced in June. It exists already in Insider's preview build. So if you're on Insiders, you have GPU compute support, which means you can go and run on NVIDIA GPUs and do CUDA, which is great. I demoed it in the build keynote. And that will be out, I believe, in the fall. So that's a thing as well. Cool. Chin is asking it to pre-allocate disk space. No, you only need as much disk space as it takes up, a couple of 100 megs, and then the disk will just expand as necessary. And if we look at that DF, what is it using? It's not even using that much. What is this? How many gigs? Is that 30 gigs? No, it's Docker. Where's our main file system? 3 gigs, 3.5 gigs. It's not using a lot of space. Docker uses more space than these Linux distributions. Oh, and the other thing that's fun is you can take them and trade them with your friends. Look at this. You can actually import and export Linux distributions as tar files. So if you have a favorite Linux distro that's perfectly organized, which I suspect that Chin will have, you have 3 or 4 computers, you get one perfect, you export the file system, and then you import it over on another machine. So that's pretty fun as well. All right. Export and export is a lovely feature. It is. And there is actually a WSL2 export, and I believe there's a library for like Docker images. Where was the individual that did that? I believe that someone made a friendly feature on how to basically share these tar files. But yes, you can definitely import. Maybe I wrote a blog post about that. Let's find out. Probably did. This is why we blog. Hey, look at that. I wrote a blog post about it. Easily move distributions between Windows machines. And I go in and walk through the process. And you can see here that I made a folder. I can go and import this tar file, and it shows up here. And then you go and add it to your dropdown. So that's really useful as well. Remember that these dropdowns are totally configurable. Now, one of the things that we didn't talk about yet, and I want to make it really clear, and I think it's clear now, but let's just remind ourselves. Some people who are on the call might be using 𝐷𝐷𝐻, right? And you might say, well, I don't need all this fancy stuff, Scott. I use 𝐷𝐷𝐻. And that's fine. But let's remember what 𝐷𝐷𝐻 is, right? 𝐷𝐷𝐻 is not Linux on Windows. 𝐷𝐷𝐻 is the GNU utilities that have been recompiled for Win32. Okay? And it allows you to access the Windows file system, but it is not even a Linux emulator. It's basically the bash shell. So if we go back to our original conversation we were talking about at the very beginning here, we have our OS, we have our terminal console, we have our shell of choice, lots of shells out there. And then in this case here, 𝐷𝐷𝐻 is a shell, right, using the bash shell. But is 𝐷𝐷𝐻 talking to Linux? It is not. It is talking to Windows. So be clear about that. Super important thing to know. Arturo is saying, is it possible to resolve domain names to the Linux distribution that lives in WSL2? I don't understand that question. Can you please give me more information about what you're asking? Is it possible to resolve domain names? Like that? To the Linux distro? Like that Linux distro has its own IP address. So it is on this subnet here, 192.23. If I come out here, I can do the same thing in Windows. And we can see that we have my local subnet, and then we have our Hyper-V 172.23. Yeah, so all the rules of networking and development work exactly the same, Arturo. So if you wanted to set up an alias or a host name or make a .dev or a .local, you could have full control over that because it is on a virtual network right here. We are on the 172.23 universe, and we just need to figure out how to set those IP addresses and those domain names up. So it's totally up to you. If you have a scenario that doesn't work, please ask me on Twitter, and I can definitely find out for you. Good questions, my friends. Good questions. Cool. Been talking for almost an hour, Nilesh. That was very whirlwind. A lot of great questions from a very technical crowd. Are you feeling okay, my friends? Feel free to say something in the chat. I think that Chin is going to work the WSL very hard because you have such wonderful questions. WSL Graphical Application. So yes, there's two ways to do graphical applications. You can do it now by basically hacking it together. You can run an X server of yourself, and you can do your own thing. Basically install everything, put on Ubuntu, do X launch, set your display number, all the stuff that you would ordinarily do. Or you can go and wait, because we are actually releasing GUI support directly. And GUI app support is going to come at the same time, I believe, as our support for GPU. So here's Windows 10 running a Linux File System Explorer and running a Linux mail application as a GUI. What they're going to do is they're going to use RDP, which is actually faster than Xserver, but you can use Xserver as well if you want as well. So yes, that can happen now. You can hack it, or you can wait a little bit till the end of the year. So pretty cool stuff. This is the GNOME file manager in WSL with Outlook there on the right. Good stuff. Mary, I'm very glad that you're enjoying this. People are working very hard to make this not suck, and that is the goal. I think it's a little challenging, though, because this is my opinion. People like to just say just. Think about this. A team of 10 people work for a year and a half to make Linux work on Windows in a seamless and clean way. And in our attempt to understand it, we say things like, oh, you're just doing this, or oh, you're just doing that. Well, if it was just that easy, we would have just done it 20 years ago, right? So there's kernel changes. There's a lot of sophistication going on here. I want to encourage everyone to go and search for WSL2 architecture. And there's some really fascinating stuff about how this is being designed, comparing the two, what you should use, what you shouldn't use, why you should use them, about using the Linux file system for faster support and things like that. Now, Swesh, you're asking about an inbuilt GUI. What does that mean? A GUI for the terminal or a GUI for Linux? Give me a little bit more on that one. And there's some really, really interesting articles about how this works, about how WSL2 architecture. Good stuff, my friends, good stuff. While you're thinking about giving me more detail, I wanted to find you the architecture diagram, which is lovely. Is this the old one? This is the new one. There you go. That's a pretty good one. There you go. That's a nice. There's a nice layout. You can look at that one while we're thinking. Swesh. No. So a GUI for Linux will not be installed by default. That's a great question. Let's do this. Let me go out to Ubuntu here. We're in our Punit folder here. I'll clear this out, and I'll go and say sudo apt update. That's how you add software. So Swesh, we're not going to add any software. You'll use apt or snap to go and get that. So here I can go and say upgrade. There you go. And now I'm upgrading my Ubuntu. If I were going to install the GNOME Explorer, I would do it with apt in this example here. Good question. Yeah, and I think this is another interesting question to your point, Swesh, about is this going to be included out of the box? You remember earlier, I think it was Chu who was asking about allocating disk space. We're not going to ship a 30 gig instance of Linux. We're going to ship as little as possible. That way you get to decide what you want on your Linux and what you don't. And then, of course, as I get it set up, I can go and export and import and do whatever makes me happy. I've even customized this. You could add 𝐷Win if you wanted to here. So for example, while this is updating, I'm going to go and I'll come here and I'll say false on git bash. I'm going to make that available to me here. So now I've got 𝐷Win versus, in git bash available. So I've got real Linux doing an upgrade, and then, oops, fake Linux. It looks like git is in another folder. Where is git now? Oh, it's called bash now? Okay. I'll fix that. We'll change that to bash. All very easy to, there we go. And now I'm in that version of bash, which is not Linux, and this one's still updating, which is going really, really well. Great question from YouTube from Keith, are we working on a cross-platform UI software stack? That's an interesting question. I believe, actually, you would probably want to look at the stuff that Scott Hunter talked about with a cross-platform UI. It's called .NET MAUI. .NET MAUI, the multi-application or multi-platform app UI. So Keith Hill from YouTube, you're going to check that out. And that will allow you to make native cross-platform UIs. That's one thing to think about. And then Steve Sanderson, who works on Blazor, has a lovely blog, and he's got a thing called Web Window. Now, Keith was saying that he uses Electron now, but basic apps use 100 megs of RAM with a lot of disk footprint. What if you could just do this? Web Window, boom, and you wouldn't even ship Electron. That would be a really nice thing. So I would encourage you to take a look at that experiment, the Web Window, and that would allow you to have nice little clean apps that use whatever local already installed web renderer. That way you don't carry Chrome and Chromium along the way. Chin has an excellent and very thoughtful question there saying, what's the ultimate aim of this project? Is it to enable GNU Linux apps to run on the Windows desktop or to have Linux apps running on Windows Server? The point of Windows Subsystem for Linux, why would you do this? One word, development. I like Windows. I enjoy it very much. Remember at the very beginning, when I see that, I feel excluded. Now I can go and apt install Redis server. Windows developers can do whatever they want now. Mac is lovely. It makes lovely hardware, but Mac is not Linux. It's Darwin, some kind of BSD Mac-specific thing. And it is nice that I now, on a Windows machine, can run as many Linuxes as I want, very, very, very fast. It is about development. Yes, you can run GUIs on Windows Desktop. Yes, you could run Linux apps on Windows Server, but why would you? What you want to do is be able to have your development lifecycle be as clean and as fast as possible and reflect the reality of deployment. So when we look at the example I gave before of my personal podcast, which is over here, I deploy this on Linux on Azure. So I build it in Docker, I test it on Azure, and when I'm running it on Linux on Windows, I know it will run in Linux in the cloud just right. Riwat is asking, I guess I'm asking if it's possible to resolve domain names to the Linux distro that lives in WSL2. If the DNS for that domain name spins up and gives back the IP address of what's inside there, yes, it would be possible. I think that's kind of a weird thing, because again, this is for development purposes, but yes. Oh, last thing I want to show before I go to sleep, my friends, and we'll pick on Puneet again. Check this out. Here's Puneet's Hello World application, remember? Let's say code dot, and what I'm going to do is I'll close this Visual Studio Code so I have no codes open. This is just, boom, look. I just ran Visual Studio Code. It says updating VS Code server. VS Code server. Visual Studio Code started up. It's in Windows, but it knows that it's talking to WSL. Okay? And now, when I say open file, is that the standard file open dialog? No, that's the Linux file open dialog. That's the home Puneet folder with all our stuff in it. If I said show local, that's the one you'd expect to see, right? So file, open file gives me that. So this means I'm actually here in Linux. I could go and put a startup and put a breakpoint here. I'm going to hit F5, start debugging. I'm building my .NET application. I've now dropped in, I'm running it. And look, I'm at a breakpoint. So I'm in Visual Studio code, talking to WSL2, and I've got my application ready to go. Exactly. Chu points out that the VS Code is installed on Windows and we trigger it. We're actually cheating a little bit because code, I believe, is a shell script, and it sees that it's running Windows. It knows what happens in the context it's running within, and then it splits in half and runs the server in Linux and the client outside. It is a lovely, lovely thing here. Yeah. Now, Chin makes an interesting point here, like developers often develop on Apple Mac OS and then run on Linux servers for deployment. They do that. My challenge with that is that running on Apple Mac OS is not the same as running on Linux servers for deployment because Apple Mac OS is not a Linux server. That's why running in Docker in both places makes things a lot nicer and cleaner, in my opinion. Last thing I want to share with you from my blog just a couple of days ago. If you hit my blog, and we'll go to the date, I believe it was in July. There we go. Look at this, my friends. This is a nice place to end. Official support for remote debugging a Linux app from Visual Studio proper. Look at that. I've got WSL2, IIS Express, and Docker all inside of Visual Studio 2019. To Nilesh's point, a really good combination. Hello, Rajesh Kumar. Thank you for saying hello in our chat. Chu is pointing out that developing in Mac OS is similar to Linux when compared to Windows. Yes, it was historically, and you're absolutely right, not the case anymore because we have choice, and that's really nice. All right. I think it's time for bed for me, my friend, and time for lunch for you all. Is that cool with you, Nilesh?
Yes. That's, I think, a very, very good session, Scott. Unless other people have any other question, I think it's been a fantastic session for all of us, and we all learned something new today.
Yeah, it's real
information in an hour, isn't it? Yeah. Chin is asking what time zone I'm in. I am in GMT -7. It is 10 o'clock at night right now, 10:15. I want to encourage you all to look at my podcast, little advertisement here. I've got a show that's every week, a lot of lovely people talking about technology. I would encourage you to check it out, called Hansel Minutes. You can find it on your podcasting network. Thank you for putting this together, Nilesh. I appreciate your organization and your persistent, and Riwut for running OBS.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks a lot.
Thanks,
I
Scott.
appreciate the time you took. It's quite late. We understand that it's almost close to your bedtime now. So I won't hold you long for anymore. Really appreciate you taking this time out and sharing this information with us. I hope that sometime in future, once this COVID is out and we get back to the new normal, we will have a chance to see you in Singapore live for one of the upcoming events.
I would, when it all goes back to the way it was before, I would love to come back to Singapore. Actually, I'm trying to wonder if I have any photos from when I was in Singapore. 1999.
Oh, it's very long.
It's been a while.
Yeah.
A while. Yeah, time to go back home, right?
Yeah. Time to visit our meetup, our group, community group here.
I will absolutely come to your meetup the next time I'm that side.
Yeah. So before we close down, Scott, if anybody has a question, maybe we can take one question, last one. But in the meantime, I would like to share my screen just for a couple of minutes and just to share the upcoming events which we have.
Go ahead.
Okay. Are you able to see my screen?
I would make it a little bigger with Control+. There you go. That looks nice.
Okay. So somebody was saying in the chat that we would like to have more events. So In a couple of weeks, on 12th of August, we have John Seville, who is the Principal Cloud Solution Architect at Microsoft. He'll be talking about Active Directory 101. And if you look at his YouTube channel, just like Scott, he's also a very good teacher, and he goes on the whiteboard and he explains stuff in a very, very nice manner. So I would recommend that you attend this session. And apart from this, so this is part of the Azure Singapore user group. We also have the MVP community in Singapore, which is very, very active in organizing other community events. And we have Ben, who is organizing the Monkey Fest. So there is one event on 11th of August. There is also the data guys who are doing the sessions. They are running multiple series or its episodes, and I'll be speaking at the episode 7 along with one more gentleman. And the AI community as well as Office. So we have Renee here, who is organizing the Office 365 user group. They have a session planned on 11th of August, and there is also Setu and Priyanka who are doing Azure AI. So I recommend that you subscribe to these events as well as our YouTube channel. So thank you all for attending this session. And once again, Scott, thanks a lot for taking time out and helping us a lot.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.